Here's a guy who thinks that atheists don't value evidence.
The question I have for any and every atheist is, would you convert to Christianity if there was evidence of God and of Christ being God?
That depends on what you mean by convert. If I saw convincing evidence that the tenets of Christianity were true, then I'd be convinced of the tenets of Christianity. If that's what you mean by convert to Christianity, then yes. However, I imagine being a Christian means more than simply believing that Jesus is God. If Christianity is true and Satan exists, he probably believes that Jesus is God. I don't think that makes him a Christian. Insofar as being a Christian means worshiping God and accepting Jesus as my savior, then no, I would not convert to Christianity even if I became convinced of its tenets.
If you say no, then clearly that's a problem.
Why? That's not clear to me at all. What's the problem? Being convinced by evidence that Jesus is God is a completely separate issue from whether I care to worship him.
But those who say yes, that if there was evidence showing that Christ was God and that God himself was real, you would indeed convert to Christianity. Now, what would you say about those having received all that evidence who still say no? Would you say they are now being irrational because they're not following evidence?
If I'm convinced by the evidence, how am I not following the evidence?
If you're an honest atheist, you will say yes, if evidence is provided, enough so that we can confirm that Jesus Christ is God. Those who don't then come to that conclusion, even though the evidence says so, are dishonest and delusional.
Again, if I saw convincing evidence that Jesus is God, I would become convinced that Jesus is God. But Satan, if he exists, would also believe that Jesus is God. Does that mean that Satan is a Christian?
Now, what's funny is that's just the category that you actually fall in, because there is so much evidence that God is real.
The definitions of God that I hear from apologists and theologians seem so incoherent to me that I don't know what evidence for such a thing would even look like.
The fact that there is creation can only point to a creator.
How do you know that it's a fact that there is creation? How did you establish that the universe is a creation? Are you inferring that something is a creation merely from the fact that it exists? If that were a valid inference, then if God exists, he must be a creation too.
The same way your house points to a builder.
I infer that my house points to a builder because I've seen houses being built. I've never seen a universe being built. As best we can tell, the energy of the universe cannot be created or destroyed. So how could it be a creation?
The fact that you even have a problem with evil, and we call it the problem of evil, not just evil as a brute fact, or pain as a brute fact, or lack as a brute fact, shows that there is an absolute moral good.
No, it doesn't. I have a problem with eating asparagus. I find it disgusting. Does that mean that there's an absolute standard of taste? And in the problem of evil, the problem is not the evil itself, it's the contradiction inherent to the idea that there's a being which designates certain things to be evil and has the power to prevent them, but didn't.
And without a mind, that is impossible.
I think an objective standard of good and evil is impossible even with a mind. Even if there is a God who dictates morality to us, there's no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to do what God says.
And in terms of Jesus Christ as God, he is the most well-documented figure from antiquity.
I'm not sure what you mean by well-documented. All else being equal, I would consider someone who has documented themselves and their own actions as being better documented than someone who hasn't. Jesus never wrote anything himself. Paul is a better documented biblical figure in that sense. I would also consider someone who was written about during their lifetime to be better documented than someone for whom there are no surviving contemporaneous writings. That would be true of several Roman emperors of antiquity, but not Jesus. I would consider someone who was written about by people who we know for sure were direct eyewitnesses to their life to be better documented than someone about whom all the surviving documents seem to be secondhand at best. We don't have good reason to believe that any of the writings about Jesus were written by direct eyewitnesses.
And there's no good explanation for the empty tomb.
You and I must have very different ideas about what constitutes a good explanation. Any naturalistic explanation I have heard for the empty tomb is more probable than the idea that Jesus rose from the dead and walked out, because there is precedent for literally any other naturalistic explanation. We've never seen a resurrection, but there are records of people surviving crucifixion. We have plenty of records of grave robberies. We have no other records of anyone being granted a burial on the same day they were crucified, so we have reason to doubt that the tomb was ever filled to begin with. All of these explanations are more probable than the idea that a guy rose from the dead.
Nor the life of the apostles, who would live nomadic lifestyles, getting beaten, tortured, and eventually killed for their belief in something that they know to be a lie?
There is no record that any of Jesus' followers were martyred specifically for believing in the resurrection. Jesus was crucified for opposing the Roman occupation of Judea. That would put targets on the backs of his followers whether he rose from the dead or not. This seems like a far more probable explanation for their deaths than belief in the resurrection. I can understand why the Roman authorities would care about these guys being a follower of a guy who effectively rebelled against Rome, but why would they care about whether they believed in a zombie or not?
I doubt it. There's no way. Given the fact that there's evidence for God and a supernatural realm and a spiritual realm,
I don't see how there could be evidence of incoherent things.
the resurrection of Jesus Christ makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at how it was prophesied centuries and centuries and centuries before by plenty of different people over plenty of different eras.
No, it wasn't. The prophecies about the Messiah never mention that the Messiah would be crucified and resurrected. Apologists will sometimes cite passages about someone bearing some resemblance to Jesus and assume that they are prophecies about him when they are not. A common one is the passage about the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. However, Isaiah 49 explicitly explains that the servant is Israel, not Jesus. Another example is Isaiah 7:14, that in the early Greek translation says that a virgin is pregnant and will bear a son. This is inferred to be a prophecy about Mary and the birth of Jesus, but it's clearly about someone who is already pregnant and was written hundreds of years before Mary was born.
And, by the way, the prophecies that he made have thus far come to pass.
Like what? When he said, "This generation shall not pass away before his return," he was talking about the people who were alive when he said it. Clearly that one did not come true. The only way you can believe that it did is if you do some very creative hermeneutical contortionism.
You know, I was having another real deep think about the problem of evil and why there is pain and suffering in this world. Look, atheists, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that as a Christian I just don't worry about that. No, I have the same doubts and questions you have. But I really got to thinking what the opposite of evil was. And it's love. But the thing about love is, to be love, it must be self-sacrificing.
Why? Toddlers don't do a lot of self-sacrificing for their parents. Does that mean that they don't love them? Did God not love humanity before he was crucified?
And the essence of love, the central part of love, is my life for yours, or someone giving their life for yours.
So if you sacrifice your life for someone else's, then you get your life back 3 days later, is that really a sacrifice? That seems more like Jesus just sacrificed his Pesach long weekend, not his life.
It's self-sacrifice. It has to be. Every time, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a Christian. I'm saying that because it's obvious that's what love is. If somebody gives to the poor in a way that doesn't burden them at all, it's worth doing, but it's not love because it's not self-sacrificing. It's vainglorious anyway. Like, if you really think about it, it's what can I do to veil onto myself virtue without actually taking any sacrifice or any burden of yours? What can I do to look like I'm helping you carry your weight without actually carrying any?
If someone gives their time, their resources, or anything else to a cause that they see as more valuable than what they're giving up, including their own life, then they're not really sacrificing either. They're getting a return on investment, not making a sacrifice. If I give my life to save someone else's because I value that person's life more, then that's no more a sacrifice than if I give $100 to the S&P 500 in order to get more money back later on.
But the thing about giving one life for another, that cannot be faked.
If a rich person giving away money that they can easily afford to give isn't a sacrifice, it's also not a sacrifice for someone who can resurrect himself to give his life for someone.
And you'll notice at the center of Christian faith is not hatred towards creation that's fallen short.
I don't know, that's kind of what the flood looked like.
But it's a cross. And it's a cross where he who didn't have to loved us infinitely after we didn't love him, after we only sought out our own good or our own looking virtuous, like the Pharisees saying, I'm going to tear my clothes and put him up on the cross because that's how godly I want to look. I want everybody to think I'm great. I'm a leader of this religion. And then Jesus gets up on the cross looking like a criminal, getting nothing out of it.
He didn't get the salvation of humanity out of it?
That's love. That's self-sacrificing. At the center of Christianity is self-sacrificing love. And because love is self-sacrificing, there must be pain and evil to exist for it to be actionable.
I don't agree that you need to subject yourself to pain and evil in order to love someone, but even if that were true, it would be a quirk of human psychology, and God could have made us without that quirk if he wanted to.
Yes, there's pain. Yes, there's suffering in this world. Yes, there's evil. And I know that's confusing, atheists. But don't take your confusion and throw out God, because atheism, all it does is say, well, I've got this problem of evil. I've got this problem of suffering. I just have to pretend it's not objectively wrong.
What makes it objectively wrong? The fact that God says so? Why is something wrong merely because God says so? Is that also because God says so? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.